All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're here with Shai Davidai and Shabbos Kestenbaum. I'm Josh Weiner. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at NAVI, the North American Values Institute. First, thank you, Shai and Shabbos, for joining us today for this webinar. We're talking about campus chaos to K-12 classrooms, how what Shai and Shabbos experienced at Columbia and Harvard, respectively, actually is happening in the same way and also in different ways in K-12 classrooms. So before we get started, I don't think they need much introduction, but I want to introduce NAVI and then talk a little bit about some of the recent work I've seen from Shai and Shabbos. But NAVI supports American civic values in K-12 education, also combats extremism, anti-Western activism, and antisemitism in classrooms. We expose extremist activist educators and support parents to advocate for their children and for school and state policy aligned with things like curricular transparency, academic excellence, and keeping political views that chill free inquiry out of classrooms. This month, we published a paper called When the Classroom Turns Hostile, a strategic response to extremism and anti-Semitism in K-12 education. And it's a diagnosis of the problem in K-12, the vectors of transmission, and a strategic roadmap for how we believe an ecosystem should approach tackling that issue. So we're going to frame much of today's conversation around the themes and topics of that white paper. You can download that white paper, by the way, at navivalues.org/hostile classroom. Today's Shai, I saw today, actually this morning, you were in City Hall advocating, and I also watched one of your Here I Am with Shai Davidai episodes that was released with Melanie Phillips. So I recommend everybody take a look at Shai's social media today for what he was doing at City Hall. And the conversation with Melanie was fantastic. Shabbos, you were on with one of my favorites in December, but it released, I think, this week, Peter Boghossian, which was an excellent conversation. You were also on Jubilee, I think is released as well, talking with socialists about why capitalism is the way to go. And you are with PragerU now, and I think you have a regular show called, it's The Brief, I think is what it is. But I just recommend everybody go ahead and check out Shai and Shabbos's activities and content. It's always fantastic. So speaking of Prager, this kind of delves into the first topic of conversation. And one of the things that we really present in the white paper is the main problem, which is the ideological capture, the systemic ideological capture of K-12 by basically a singular worldview that has been incubated in academia, but really jumped the shark into K-12, that really we should view the world through a single lens that is an oppressor versus victim lens. And that's based mostly on your intersectional identity. And this tends to, or results in, or we believe always will, frame Jews as the powerful oppressors, Israelis as colonizers, and really requires Jews to give up their connection to the land of Israel or the country of Israel in order to be accepted or earn redemption in that worldview. The reason I mentioned Prager is because the first time I really started hearing these things back when I was, I think marching with BLM and sort of on the agenda of the left, I pulled up a Prager video, and my husband goes, "Hey, that Prager is really right-wing extremist. Like, you shouldn't be watching that stuff." And then we watched the whole video, and he was like, "Oh," And it reminds me, Shai, of you had when you had Melanie on, you talked about the veracity of the fact should really not be affected by the messenger or the medium that the fact is coming from. So, we have this issue where parents feel a little bit, because of the political situation, hesitant to talk against this singular worldview as the way that everybody should view the world. So I'll start with you, Shabbos. Can you explain why disagreeing that this is the only or virtuous way to view the world is really not partisan? And what tools can parents use to talk about it in a way that's unassailable? And what can they expect, frankly, when they start to speak out against this thing?
Sure. Well, thank you, Josh, for making this conversation possible and for all the work that NAVI is doing, and also for allowing Shai and I to reconnect. We have not spoken in a while, so it's great to see my friend again. I think Shai and I are actually pretty good examples of this. Shai and I have differences of opinion, certainly when it comes to President Donald Trump, when it comes to a lot of hot button political issues. Yet when it comes to, I would say, perhaps our bread and butter issues, when it comes to supporting the state of Israel, when it comes to Jewish Americans, when it comes to institutions of higher education and the reform that's necessary, I think in many parts, and Shai, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have a lot more agreement. And even on the things where we disagree, we understand that disagreement is not only healthy, but it's vital for our democracy. So when I talk on college campuses, or even just last night, I spoke at a local Jewish high school, and I had said, I'm going to state my opinions on certain things. And if you disagree, good, tell me why. And not only tell me why, but if you can do a good job of explaining your rationale and your position, you might even be able to convince me that I'm wrong. Again, that's what a democracy is all about. And in theory, that's what a college campus is supposed to be all about. Unfortunately, we've seen that it's quite actually the opposite. These are not spaces of intellectual rigor and academic discourse. It's very much the opposite, but I digress. In terms of what I often tell parents, and perhaps I'll focus this specifically to Jewish parents, unity does not mean uniformity. Unity does not mean that we agree on everything. Unity recognizes that we have differences of opinion, yet that's what makes us strong. I mean, to sound a little superficial, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So long as we recognize the fundamental conclusions, the fundamental goals. As I said, a strong state of Israel, supporting American Jews on college campuses, making sure our American institutions of higher learning are bastions of free, the exercise of free thought and speech. We all agree on those things. We may just disagree on how best to get there. And I think one of the scariest things, not only for our democracy, but on a more micro level, when it comes to the Jewish community, I'm not particularly scared, maybe I should be, but I'm not particularly scared when I get death threats or when people who burn American flags saying that I'm next. It doesn't really faze me. Again, maybe it should, but it doesn't really bother me. What I do get bothered by, I really do mean this, is when you'll have the Jewish high school or a Jewish organization or a conference that say, look, I know you were slated to speak about this one particular thing, but we saw your opinion on these other particular things, and we just can't have you speak anymore. That, to me, is way more dangerous to our democracy and way more dangerous to the fabric of our American Jewish collective if we can't even have conversations on things we disagree with. So if people disagree with my politics, good. Tell me why I'm wrong, and maybe you can convince me. I was one way on October 6th of 2023, and now I'm on a different way of October 6th of 2025. So that's kind of my message. Disagreement is really healthy. It's really vital. And don't let that destroy interpersonal relationships. Don't let that destroy friendships or your own organizations. You know, you should encourage a multitude of ideological perspectives.
I would add to that, I run a grassroots organization in New York City, a Zionist activist group. And our first meeting, someone brought up politics. And I said very clearly, I don't care. I don't care about your politics. Maybe one-on-one, it's nice to have a conversation. I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. I don't care. What I care about is whether your identity as a Jew, as a Zionist, as an American or Israeli like myself, whether that goes above your politics. And I told people, if you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, you're welcome to be here. But if you put your political identity above your Zionist identity, your Jewish identity, your American identity, then maybe this is not the space for you, right? You're allowed to do that, but then that becomes partisan. And to me, the biggest problem is even if we put our Jewishness aside, even if we put our Zionism aside, the fact that people tell you there is one idea and all other ideas or objections are not welcome, that should trigger a red alert. And it doesn't matter if that idea comes from the right, the left, top, bottom, whatever it is. Wherever I go to an institution, a group, a community, and they say, here's the idea or truth with a capital T, and I say, wait. Then there's no conversation. Now we're in indoctrination land. And that to me is the big problem. So, parents, if you feel like there's some ideas that you can't challenge, that is exactly why you must challenge them. In fact, these ideas, they prosper out of fear and self-censorship, right? It's not, no one, at least not now, not yet in the United States, no one is checking on what you're saying and erasing things you're saying, but they will scare you to erase your own words, to check your own words. And that to me is a as much or even more of a danger of censorship.
By the way, in the United Kingdom, they're actually there. I mean, you can have police come to your house based on what you post on social media. But I think a hallmark of this that parents deal with is the way that it's framed is that racism, for example, is not necessarily prejudice against a group for their identity, but that group needs to be in a power dynamic where it's somebody punching down on the other. And if you don't agree with that, you're then framed as the racist because you're upholding that racism. So I think how do parents deal with that? The fact that they're just going to be framed as some deplorable thing that society has said is deplorable if they stick up for themselves in these spaces.
So first of all, I would say, if I may take this question, one, you must first understand what you're battling against, right? It's, yes, we know there's an oppressor-oppressed schema, but you really need to understand what it is, because the person that's going to be accusing you should never have more knowledge than you, right? So I tell parents, go and learn about it so that you can, challenge them. Second thing you have to remember, this is not about you, this is about your kids. You can call me whatever thing you want in the world. I am fighting for my kids, and I don't care. And yesterday I saw someone wrote that I'm a racist, bigoted, Zionist genocider, and I said one of those words are correct. But I don't care, because the really thing that matters, and maybe this is me and Shabbos had to grow a thick skin very quickly, but when you know you're not a racist, so you can call me a racist. I don't care, because the people that know me, that listen to me, that talk with me, they know that I'm not a racist. Now, I'm not going to do the thing where I was like, here are all my people of color friends, and here, no, I don't need that. People that know me know that I'm not a racist. The people that I care about know that I'm not a racist, not a bigot. So now that they know that, I don't care about what the other side says. That being said, I know it's a lonely fight. So I tell parents, I tell high schoolers, I tell college students, don't do this alone. Don't go the Shabbos and Shai way, right? Find I call this the secular minyan. Find the 10 people that will fight with you. And you know that whatever happens, you can, go to your secular minyan and talk about what happened and realize that you're not alone. And then even if you're fighting thousands, you have your group.
And if I can quickly jump in as well to really animate what Shai's saying, because he's absolutely right. NAVI focuses on K through 12. Often when it comes to discourse on American anti-Semitism, we're focusing on the college campuses. Whether that's the right focus or the wrong focus, that's just what the focus is. But I'll give you one quick example, and I'm preaching to the choir here. Everyone knows December 6, 2023, that was the infamous congressional testimony, the most watched congressional testimony in American history, more than 2 billion views and counting, where Claudine Gay of Harvard, Liz McGill of UPenn, and Sally Kornblue of MIT are asked by Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, do the calls for genocide against Jewish people violate your code of conduct? Of course, they say, it depends on the context. And then they insist 30 seconds later, no, we promise it really does depend on the context. And so that generated a lot of outrage. However, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, they had close to a dozen hearings on religious discrimination in that 1 year. And I would argue, and I think you, Josh, would agree with this, maybe Shai, you would agree with this too, but the most important hearing on religious discrimination was not on Columbia University or Harvard University or MIT. It was anti-Semitism in K through 12. And that was the least attended. I know because I happened to have been on Capitol Hill that day. There were very few people there. It was the least reported, but it was probably the most important, because when we focus on the Ivy Leagues, for example, Columbia, Harvard, qualitatively, I think there's an argument to be made that these graduates will go on to hold a disproportionate amount of power. And that's why we're concerned, because, statistically speaking, it's not an absurd assertion to state I probably sat in a room with a future congressman, senator, even president. So, it's a good point. Having said that, though, quantitatively, we're not talking about a heck of a lot of people. When we talk about K through 12, we're talking about tens of millions of Americans. And unless you're homeschooled, which there is an increasing share of people who are homeschooling, but still, unless you're homeschooling, every American is going through the K through 12 system. So when you have, and this is documented in your report, but when you have young kids in third grade, reading I is for Intifada, that is a profound problem. And it underscores what Shai was just saying to parents. I think the most important tool you can be teaching your own kids or the community or the neighborhood or whatever is having those strong secular minyanim, whatever the term is. When you come into a college campus or when you come into a high school, you already know these are my values, these are my principles, and these are the things I'm very proud to believe in. And that starts kind of very, very young. And that's why I'm sure you'll ask us later on, if we had $1 billion or we were starting our own nonprofit, where would the money go to? And I always talk about, well, if we were serious about combating anti-Semitism, we would reinvest as much of our resources, as many of our resources, as quickly as possible into like education, instilling a love and a sense of knowledge and wisdom and purpose into young American Jews so they can understand their relationship as patriotic American citizens and their role in Jewish history vis-a-vis the state of Israel today.
Yeah, we'll get a little bit into that a little bit later, but I wanted to ask too, just about like those values, right? And specifically, we have a lot of Jewish people on the call or on the webinar. So tell me, Shabbos, like a little bit, talk to me about how Jewish values are related to American or what is known as capital L liberal values, and how those things can be, whether they're instilled in our kids or institutions, a stalwart against what we're seeing from an ideological perspective.
Yeah, great question. And this is how I concluded my speech at the Republican National Convention quite deliberately. I made the point of saying, while the Ivy Leagues may have abandoned the United States of America, the Jewish people never will, because Jewish values are American values and American values are Jewish values. And full disclosure, I kind of stole that from Hillary Clinton's famous Beijing, China speech in the 90s when she says women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, but I digress. What I mean by that is to be Jewish today is to have, in technical terms, it's Dina de Malchus Adina, is that we have a love and appreciation of the country we are currently living in. And that, of course, is the United States of America. I actually mentioned this on the podcast with Peter yesterday. We Americans, when people accuse us of dual loyalty, for example, first of all, we don't really see it that way, because do you have more loyalty to your mother or your father? Well, I love them both. And in fact, when my mother and father get along, I as the child benefit, and the whole town benefits greatly when they're in a loving relationship, but I digress. But I go to DC quite often, and to sound quite nerdy, I can't tell you the emotions I experience when I take friends to the Lincoln Memorial, or, we walk down the Washington Monument late at night. The emotions that stirs up within inside of me, just the immense feeling of pride that I get to be part of this experiment of democracy that is now in its 250th year. So I think first and foremost, it's a love and it's an appreciation of the country we are living in. That's the United States. So I think that's the first synergy of Jewish values and American values. And the second, pertinent to our conversation, of course, is religious freedom, that people but must have the right to practice their faith or their lack of faith to the extent that they would like. Religious freedom is a hallmark, not just of the Jewish practice. We're not proselytizing. We're not trying to convert. We respect other faiths. And if anything, I would even take it a step further. And I, as an Orthodox Jew, I'm quite comfortable, and I say this a lot on TV, that if you're a Christian, go to church, read the New Testament, get closer to God, build a family, get married, have kids. I think that would be really healthy and helpful for our American society. And then the third, and this is certainly pertinent to our conversation on college campuses, is also the ability to respect diverging viewpoints. So freedom of speech, you have a right and in some cases, an obligation to say the things you feel and to say the things you want to say. We should not stifle your speech. As Charlie Kirk taught me, the only way to combat bad ideas is with better ideas. I think that's fundamentally a Jewish value. We are not dominant. We are not trying to assert our way of life or our culture on other people. We simply want our way of life to be respected in the same way we absolutely will defend and respect your way of life. So that's why I think fundamentally, when we talk about Jewish values and we talk about American values, we really are talking about the same thing. Don't do unto others that which you would not want done unto yourself.
Shai, I'm curious whether you think about this the same or differently, just as having a different background from Shabbos, from where you're from.
So of course, like when I speak, I always have to say two caveats. One, I'm not an American citizen yet. I've lived here for 15, 16 years. And two, I'm an atheist Jew, right? Well, let's put that aside, because what I'm going to, what I want to say is, I have never really thought too much about Jewish values, American values, maybe because I saw them as like so inherently together that I didn't even have to consider it. But to me, it all starts with, we take these truths to be self-evident, right? And no one really thinks about, why are they self-evident? Where does this self-evidentary, value comes from? Well, it comes from the idea, which started with the Jewish religion, Jewish civilization, that all people were created in the same image, the image of God. Again, even if you believe or don't believe, that's the idea, that's the story. And because we're all equal, because we're all in the same image, then our truths that we are, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness comes from that. So, I do this thing when I talk with high schoolers, and I say, well, we talk a lot about Judeo-Christian values, but what are they, right? And I find that a lot of people, we take it for granted, but we don't really think about it. So that's why, and we're talking about K through 12. It always starts with educating yourself so that then you can go and educate other people, right? I tell people, I keep 7 out of the 10 commandments. I don't keep the first 3 because they're theistic, but I keep all the other 7, right? And I would say that most people in the United States of America, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindu, Buddhists, whatever, they are with me. Maybe they don't keep the Sabbath, but they keep those fundamental moral basic truths. And a society can only exist if we have those fundamental basic truths. When we see, and we'll maybe get to this in colleges and now seeping into K through 12, the idea that there are no truths, that it's all about lived experience, that it's all about my truth and your truth, because I have feelings, then that makes that truthful. That breaks down because society is no longer sitting around the same, big fire. We're all scattered around. And that's my big worry about K through 12, that we're not channeling everyone towards the same goal. It can be a broad tent. It can be many different values, but the goal has to be the same. This liberal, democratic values, Judeo-Christian values, you can name them whatever you want, American values, Jewish values, focus on the values.
Yeah, let's be specific about this. I'll pick out a specific value, and you mentioned it earlier, Shabbos, pluralism, e pluribus unum. The idea that we have a country that out of many, we come together as one. While what's being taught in universities and in school is more of a framework of diversity. And diversity is great and it sounds good, but it's kind of we want to center the voices that are diverse that we have not centered in the past at the behest of others. And that may be counter to what pluralism actually means. Can you guys talk about how does pluralism actually help us in a conversation with these people who think this way?
I actually really like this question. I happened to have been speaking about this yesterday. So I think what you're describing in terms of the practical or contemporary applications of pluralism is not e pluribus unum, but it's really e unum pluribus, whereby they're not saying, no, what our strength is taking the multitudes and becoming one. They're saying, yeah, we're one, we live in the United States, but actually we're all very diverse with different goals and different ethnicities and different pursuits. I think that's actually quite destructive. So if you're celebrating diversity to say, look at how we come from different backgrounds and different races and different sexual orientations and different ethnicities, yet nevertheless, we are all on the same page about American exceptionalism or American values or religious freedom or whatever it may be, then great. I think that's diversity and pluralism in its most heightened states. But we're seeing, particularly on college campuses, don't blend into, don't assimilate, don't become the American that we were taught to become when we were taking our citizenship test. I was born here, but I'm giving the example of an immigrant who's coming here. But rather, you should hold on to all of the things that make you unique, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Again, Jews, we hold on to our practices and our customs as we absolutely should. And I would encourage anyone of any faith to do that as well, while also recognizing that you are living in a pluralistic society, meaning you are going to engage. In fact, you must engage, whether it's in commerce, whether it's in culture, whether it's in business, you are going to engage with different people who believe and say and speak differently than you. And again, I think the practical application on American college campuses with diversity is there's actually no inherent need. There's no obligation for individuals to try to assimilate into American culture. That's kind of like the new wave of thinking as it pertains to immigration and also diversity. And I think that's actually kind of destructive. So again, you could watch the interview I had with Peter, but towards the end, his cameraman, it was a really fascinating interview. His cameraman calls me racist, and I'm used to be called a racist, not typically by the people holding the camera. And so Peter kind of brought him on and said, okay, let's discuss, why am I a racist? Where did the accusation come from? And at one point it became a question of citizenship. So I asked him a very practical question. I said, he said that we must take in all different types of peoples, all different type of ethnicities and beliefs into the United States. And I said, okay, well, I have a very practical question. Child marriage is a tremendous problem throughout the Arab Middle East. In Iraq, for example, there is no age of consent law. So if I'm applying to be a United States citizen, and I'm writing on my visa application that I fully intend on keeping with my traditions and like marrying a child once I get the approval to come to the United States. So I asked this cameraman, like, would that be something you're okay with? And he said, yes. And I found that kind of shocking, I would say, because that to me is diversity in its worst form. I think we have to be okay with, and Shai, maybe you disagree with this, I'd love to hear your take on this, but I think we have to be okay with saying, and this is the paradox of intolerance, that not all cultures are equal. I love America because I believe in American exceptionalism, and I believe Western civilization is an inherently better system than other civilizations in the past. I believe when we respect other faiths, when we respect other cultures, when we have a market capitalist economy, I think that's much better than cultures or countries or civilizations that don't do those things. And if you want to come into the United States, we would love to have you. I mean, I'm a child of immigrants. We would love to have you. And in fact, America is a country of immigrants, and we need immigrants in order to bolster our economy. But there are certain policies and values you have to subscribe to. And if you don't want to subscribe to those values, that's your prerogative. You don't have to, but then we also don't have to take you. And Mahmoud Khalil is probably the best example of this, who at Columbia University, forget about he lied on his visa application. He denied his affiliations with the United Nations Relief Works Agency, but he's repeatedly called, it's still on their Instagram, I think, he's repeatedly called for the eradication of Western civilization. So again, if you don't like Western civilization, that's fine. You have the right to say that thing. What you don't have is the right to come to this country and then call for the eradication of the country you're living in. And I'm bothered by the fact that people my age, especially on college campuses, see this as a controversial statement.
Yeah, I would only add, I would add a few things, actually. One thing is, notice how, because we started with like parents worried about speaking up, being called a racist. And regardless of what you think about what Shabbos said now, and you agree or disagree, and I'd say I agree with 80%. Maybe there's like 20% disagreement. Nothing that he said
is pretty high. That's pretty high coming from Shai, 80%.
Nothing that you said is based on race. It is based on culture, nationality, but when we created as a society a word, a catch-all for evil, right? It's like the Voldemort, don't say racist 3 times. Like, nothing what he said now is racist. Now you could say that it's biased toward a culture or a nationality. I don't think so, but you could say that. But notice already, like if you're worried about being called a certain word, like let's take the heat down because it's not even related to that. Now, in terms of culture, I don't know. The truth is, I have the ways of how I think my life should be, and that's how I raise my children. My wife and I agree on most things. We disagree on some things, right? You have your own way. You're welcome to come to Shabbat dinner if you're Jewish or not Jewish, if you're observant or not observant. If you're observant, we'll make sure to have kosher food, even though we don't keep kosher, and kosher plates and everything, right? But I'm not going to force you to align with my rules, but I will force you to keep, to have some respect for my rules, or go do your own thing at your own home, right? What's true in the city, in the block level, true on the neighborhood level, city level, state level, and so forth. So for me, like the idea of pluralism is incredible. We should all have opinions. And by the way, if you want to argue in like Harvard or Columbia for child marriage, you should have the ability. The problem is that when we now say that all views are equally valid, and that's not what pluralism is about. Pluralism is not about you and I have different truths, so we're equally valid. No, there is something that we're seeking. We're in the pursuit of some objective truth, right? You can have input, but if your input is not based on fact, logic, evidence, it's going to be weighted less than if it is. If your input is not based on historical reality, then it's going to be based less. And by the way, if your input is just not based on how things currently work, it's going to be valued less. That's not what it goes in universities. In fact, I don't have any problem with diversity. I have a problem with DEI as an ideology, the DEI ideology. But diversity is important. Diversity that's flattened to melanin in your skin is the dumbest thing in the world. It should be life experience. It should be thought diversity. It should be class diversity that no one really talks about. It should be all these other things, not like, can I grow a beard or not? Is my hair curly or not? Am I darker or lighter skin? That's not diversity. That's just idiocracy.
Yeah, and I'd argue in K-12 we haven't even seen the idea that all opinions or views are equal, but actually that certain views are more important to be explored than others based on the lived experience of the individual who's professing them, and the lived experience of people who are considered oppressors or colonizers are actually dismissed and left aside and not actually explored. So we're not even getting to the veracity of the argument or the veracity of what actually happened in history, but we're skewing history for that. But I want to take this to your guys' experience in academia, pushing back against some of the stuff that you went through and how that may be applied in K through 12 for parents. There's a lot of differences between K-12 and academia. There's more centralization in academia. There's more federal leverage in academia, but there are some similarities. There's foreign funding that influences K through 12. There's activist organizations and networks who are influencing K-12. There's administrative bureaucracy. There's degradation of professional norms. There's politicized curricula. Those things are all things that you all experienced. So when parents are trying to push back against those things in their local school or with the state, what have you learned in pushing back against those things that might be helpful for a parent who wants to push back in their local school or in their state?
I want to highlight the biggest difference between colleges and schools K through 12, which I think will really help explain why it's so important and how we need to fight it. In college, no matter, we can say that these are miseducated, brainwashed, whatever. In a seminar room, there are 15 adults, a professor and 14 students. In a lecture, there are 300 adults, a professor and 299 students. In K through 12 classes, there is one adult. And that is the biggest problem, because what your kids are hearing in class, they don't have the intellectual abilities yet, and they don't have the rhetorical abilities yet to even say, hey, this is wrong, or I have a question. So it's way harder to fight K through 12 because now it falls on the parents to monitor what's going on, and then if there's a problem, to push back. Now, as a parent, and I have a fourth grader and I have a kid that's next year is going to be in kindergarten. And as a parent, that is not what I signed up for, right? We parents, we tend to treat our school just like we treat doctors. Like, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to put my kids there when, I trust you to give them the education that they need to deal with this world and bring back my kid without any additional baggage, just the education. That trust is being broken right now by teachers, and especially by teacher organizations, unions, etc., and we can talk about the college indoctrination of those teachers. So it's on parents to first start monitoring, have conversations with your kids. Because for me, when I started fighting at Columbia, it was very easy. I went online, started Googling professors' names, student leaders' name, and all that stuff, and I could find all this information and read it. But you need to know what your kid is going through. You need to look at their books. You need to have conversations with them. You need to ask them, not were you bullied for being a Zionist? But hey, did anyone ever mention Israel? Did anyone ever mention the Middle East? There's a war going on. What is being talked about? If you don't know, then you can't fight it. That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say that this is different from colleges is you need to assume, or at least try to assume, the ignorance rather than hatred. I'll give you an example. A Israeli-American teenager, he's in 9th grade in a Boston area high school, and right after October 7th, so this was really pertinent in his mind, they got in some class a text to analyze, and it said about in Judaism, Parashat Lech Lecha, where God instructs Abraham to go forth to, leave his father's land and go forth to his own land. And they say God instructed Abraham to go to Palestine. Now, every adult, and luckily this high schooler, that has a little bit of half a brain knows that chronologically, forget anti-Semitism, chronologically, that's not correct, right? The word Palestine, the name Palestine, arrives about 1,500 years after the assumed, Abraham leaving his father's home. Now, this kid had the courage and the intelligence to go and say wrote an entire passage to their class, to their teacher, why this is factually incorrect and can also lead to anti-Semitism. Important to say as a side note that they had their parents' full support. And that's extremely important for a 14 or 15-year-old, knowing that their parents have their back. They went to their teacher, and the teacher said two things. One that's more worrying and one that's a little bit hopeful. The worrying part was that the teacher said, I've been using this for 20 years and no one's ever complained. Right? That means that 20 years of kids have received the false idea that Palestine preceded the Jewish existence in the land. And therefore, slowly you get to think that why are we even there? We're not indigenous, right? But the second thing, and maybe more hopeful, that the teacher said that this wasn't out of ill will. He just never thought about it. It never crossed his mind. He got the material from someone else. Maybe that someone else was hateful, but the teacher was ignorant. And the teacher changed, and this was in 2023, and they no longer use this specific text. Now, this is one tiny example from one school in one city in one district. Multiply that by the millions and millions of kids going to schools everywhere. So you need to monitor what your kids are going through. You need to give them, your full support. And yes, you need to assume that there's no hatred, but then still push back.
I would agree with all that, and I would just piggyback off of the last point, which is the malicious intent isn't often there. It's more often than not just in my personal experiences, and then anecdotally what individuals from a broad range of educational models, whether it's a college campus or a high school or even a middle school, it really comes down to ignorance. And we need more young people like the one Shai just described who said, well, hang on, just historically, this is tremendous disservice to the historical record. The other, not contention, but the dichotomy here is when it comes to K through 12, I think there's a suspension of disbelief that does not really apply to a college campus for a whole host of reasons. So one of the reasons I think that college campuses got so much outsized attention is because it was quite easy to just film it. It was quite easy to document what was happening. It was quite easy to talk to people who can articulate ideas and can articulate their experiences either in person or on TV or file a lawsuit. Like you can hear about these things because it's just well documented. K through 12, it's a very different system. First and foremost, as Shai just said, you're dealing with one adult and everyone else are incapable, for the most part, of kind of expressing big comprehensive ideas, which is why, to your point, it's kind of crucial that when you do have kids, whether it's your own personal kids or just young people in the community telling you that I had such and such an experience, it's important not to dismiss those concerns. Again, there is a suspension of disbelief that teachers know what they're doing and that the school board has all of our best intentions in mind. And that probably is true for the vast majority of cases. But sometimes you do have cases of ignorance or in even smaller cases, malicious intent. And it is important that we call that out, but we will only be able to call that out if we trust what our own kids are telling us. And I remember, I don't remember if it was Oakland or Philadelphia, so maybe you guys can fact check me on this, but one of the schools, again, either in Oakland, California or in Philadelphia, they brought their students to have a real world experience of what it means to be an activist. And they brought them to an anti-Israel Globalize the Intifada rally. And it was the Free Press who did an expose on this initially. They're the ones who broke the story. And even I, who I'm in the Jewish activism space, even I had trouble really believing that this was occurring. There's just no way. It's just so absurd. It can't possibly be true. So even I am guilty of not really believing young people when they are telling us like these are actual things that are actually happening. So first and foremost, we owe it to ourselves selfishly, but more importantly and fundamentally, we owe it to those young people who are brave enough to speak out. We owe it to them to actually say, not only do I believe you, but here are the practical steps I'm going to take with you to alleviate those concerns.
Yeah, and we guide parents to, you have to understand your kids. Some kids are equipped to do this kind of thing and notice these kind of things and push back about these things and report them to their parents, and some aren't. And the ones that are, have the conversation with them that in the classroom, if you see this, that, or the other, let me know, and always be talking with them. I think what happens with parents, though, is they get frustrated because what they push back. It's over and over. They get really no accountability from the school board or from the administration, and they feel like they're banging their heads against the wall because oftentimes we have maybe a few people in maybe one or two or maybe three people in the district who do have malicious intent, or they think it's not malicious intent, but it's this worldview that will cause these problems. And then there's other people that are kind of going along with it because they think it's the right thing to do, or it aligns well with what they learned in the colleges of education. At this point, you would think parents, they're left with a choice, right? I either have to pull my kid out, put him in a Jewish day school, or I have to build a community that's going to run for school board and change the power dynamics in this school. So let's talk about that a little bit, like that parental choice. Shai, you have kids. How do you think about this?
So I'll be honest with you. And this is not a point that I'm proud of, but it also shows that I'm with you. I'm not, Shabbos and I are not special. I mean, Shabbos is a bit special, but we're just people that spoke up and keep speaking up. When Zohar Mamdani got elected to New York City, there was talk, luckily it didn't happen, that Jamal Bowman would become the chancellor of the New York City public schools. My son goes to a public school. That was a decision that my wife and I made based on our values. We wanted to expose him. We said, we'll take care of the Jewish education. He'll go to a public school. But that was the first moment that I was like, maybe we should pull him out. Maybe we shouldn't have him, and maybe we should do the opposite. We'll take care of the secular education at home and send him to a Jewish school. And there's no judgment. Some people do one, some people do the other. And my wife said, if we're not there fighting, then we're ruining it not just for the other Jewish kids, but also for the non-Jewish kids. Because we have to remember, anti-Semitism, everybody repeats this, the Rabbi Sachs idea, but anti-Semitism is a virus, it shapeshifts. But we're missing the biggest important thing. The idea is not that it's a virus, that it shapeshifts. The idea is that it's a virus and it ruins and can kill the host body. And when a student learns something that is factually incorrect, chronologically incorrect, or just like vile opinions, that student is not getting education anymore. So that student is being sent to learn something, and they're not being taught, they're being indoctrinated. So yes, we do have to be there, although I might end up sending my kids to a Jewish private school for different reasons, but we do have to be there. We do have to fight back, again, with this assumption of there's no malice, or at least some assumption. Parents need to get involved in PTAs. Parents need to get involved in all the different meetings. But even if you don't, we all have jobs, we're all busy. I tell parents, keep a paper trail. You have to start the fight. You don't have to win the fight or even finish the fight. If you email the teacher and you have a conversation and you're not satisfied, you reply and say, like, here's the points that I heard, here's what I'm not yet satisfied. And you then go to the principal, then you go to the superintendent, and then you go to the free press, right? Because you have created a paper trail now. Now it's not your word against the teacher. Now you're not just focusing on a specific teacher, but you're focusing on a system that allows a problem to persist. And that's the problem. Just like with racism, we're not trying to eliminate all racists in the world. Ideally, I would, but we're trying to eliminate systems that allow racism. We're not trying to eliminate all sexism from the world, even though I would love to. We're trying to eliminate systems that allow sexist, homophobic, whatever it is to exist. That should be our goal. And of course, I tell people, I have gotten a platform on social media just for speaking out. That's not just my platform, it's your platform as well. If you come up with documented, like, we've tried this, we've seen all these things, you show me the facts, I'll blow up the story. And trust me, if there's one thing that public schools don't want, is media attention. And I don't do this so I can we got you, but actually to use that as a leverage. People talk about peace through strength. We can do that in the local, this is the negotiation. You're going to be a bigot. We're going to document it. And now we're going to come and say, we can expose your bigotry or you can change your bigotry.
Yeah, and before I get to you, Shabbos, on this, what you said is really important. Just documenting it and finding organizations that can support you, and how do I reply, and where does this go, and then getting it into media. A lot of people, they will comment on like my social media exposing people. It's like, okay, yeah, we exposed it, but what are we doing about it? That actually is doing something about it, because then we can take it to government officials to try to take action about what's happening. And also, it creates a conversation amongst the parents in those districts about what's actually happening in my school and what should I be really paying attention to. So I wouldn't belittle the idea of just exposing these things as a tactic, and parents play a huge role in that.
And
Shabbos,
I want to just say, it doesn't have to be a national New York Times, Washington Post.
No.
Put it in your local newspaper first, because the other parents might not even be aware of this, Jewish and non-Jewish parents. The idea of like raising awareness starts locally.
Shabbos, bring us to like that like Jewish day schools versus public schools conversation though a little bit. What are your thoughts on that? Because I get a lot of parents that are like, I'm exhausted, I'm just going to send my kids to a Jewish day school. And I have to say to Shai's point, if we all put our kids in a Jewish day school, we're going to let the anti-Semites run rampant. So,
Well, a lot of caveats and disclaimers first. Firstly, Shai, you are now on record for saying peace through strength. So we're slowly converting you to a Trump guy. So mission accomplished.
No. I have my own conclusions of that, and I can.
The second thing is, I mean, Shai mentioned Jamal Bowman. Of course, that was a tremendous concern that he would be the chancellor of the school board. I actually volunteered for Jamal Bowman when he first ran for Congress. This is in 2020. I remember speaking to him at length about the policies, progressive policies that he was planning to put in place, not just for our community in the Bronx, but really across the country. So I think it kind of underscores how much of a paradigm shift October 7th was, not just for me personally, but also for hundreds of thousands of American Jews who were very staunchly progressive and then had a bit of a rude awakening. So just a historical caveat I thought was interesting. In terms of the practicalities, look, this is where Shai and I disagree. And full disclosure, I'm an Orthodox Jew, so I'm biased on this. But I've been on the record really since my activism that every single Jew, American Jew, should be in a Jewish day school. However, I don't think they should be in a Jewish day school because it has anything to do with combating anti-Semitism and because it has anything to do with how we relate to the non-Jewish world. I think Jews should be in Jewish day school because the one thing that has sustained us for 3,000 years is Jewish education. And while it's true, I would say Shai is probably the exception to the rule, notwithstanding the fact that both he and his wife are Israeli, which helps, but also the fact they're quite loud and proud, obviously, and vocal about their Judaism in ways that a significant amount of the American Jewish community, especially American Jews who identify as atheist or secular, kind of aren't. That's not me being critical, that's just me looking at the data. So Shai is probably the exception to the rule. I think Jews should be in Jewish day school because, again, we believe in Jewish continuity and survivalhood, but more importantly than that, we believe that to live the most meaningful, inspired, passionate, and educated life is you receive a Jewish education. And why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we want to put as many resources as young as possible, as early as possible, to ensure that our kids are receiving the best education as possible? And while it's probably true, you could find exceptions like Shai and others who are willing and able to supplement a public school education with their Jewish education at home. A, as I said, that's not most American Jewish households. And B, why would you? Because if you can get the optimal education, why wouldn't you do that? In the same way, if I had an illness, God forbid, I would only want to go to the best hospital and the best doctor and receive the best care. So certainly post October 7th, I've always said, if you really want to help young people, you would ensure that there's not a single American young Jew today who's going to public school because their parents can't afford Jewish day school. As in, if they were to say, we wish our kids got this education, but it's just a money issue, that is something I lose sleep over, because clearly the American Jewish community does not lack wealth. We were just able to spend $15 million on a Super Bowl ad to encourage us to wear a blue pin. Do you know what $15 million would do for a Jewish day school? I actually speak at a lot of Jewish day schools for their dinners, like their annual fundraisers. And there are some schools that I have a fee. I'm very honest about this because it's my job and it's how I pay my rent for my crappy one-bedroom apartment. So sometimes I have to charge. But there are schools that will say, we don't have the money to pay you, because that is how dire our financial straits are. And I say, fine, I'll do it anyway for free, because that's how much I believe in this. It is so critical that we are funding Jewish day schools. They are the front line of defense, and I would even argue they are the best line of defense in ensuring Jewish continuity, and that we are raising young, passionate, and educated Jews. So if there are parents watching this, I would really urge you to think seriously and critically about if public school is really the best option for your kids. And again, people go to public school for specific reasons. So there's actually a prominent rabbi, this is actually not a secret, so I could say his name, Rabbi David Beshefkin of Teaneck, New Jersey. He's very open about the fact that one of his sons goes to public school because he needs a specialized education. He has some type of special need. I don't know the exact details. So he sends his kids to public school. I can totally get that, and I obviously respect that, and it's not my kid, so you do what works. But what I don't want is the situation we have now where there are parents who want to send their kids to a day school, but they just don't have the financial resources. And in a community as wealthy as ours, we can quite easily solve that issue. So it's not a matter of money, it's a matter of willpower.
Yeah, I think it's...
Can I add to that just because, because I agree, again, maybe even 95% here, but I say, when people ask me, like, what's your goal? What are you trying to achieve? Right? And the broad goal is Jewish continuity for sure. That's I lose sleep over Jewish continuity. But the smaller goal, the personal goal, is I want to create a world where my son and my daughter can be whomever they want when they go out into the world. Gender, in religion, in terms of nationality, in terms of sexual preference, whatever it is, right? So Jews should be able to send their kids to whatever school they want, right? And if you want to go to a Jewish day school and you can't afford it, that is a problem not for you, but for us as a Jewish community. That being said, a couple of weeks ago, it was a snow day here. It was in New York City. My son had a friend over. That friend, his dad is Catholic and from Africa. His mom is a Russian Jew, but he grew up as Catholic. He came over, we were playing, and I was wearing my shirt says Zionist, just at home, like lounging around. And he asks me, "What's a Zionist?" And this kid, and this is great because this isn't a kid that already has been brainwashed. Like he's the first time he's seen that word, and I was able to just say, "Oh, Zionist," and that kid was like, "Oh, okay," and he put that somewhere in the back of his mind, right? For me, that was the value of public school, right? Now there's a non-Jewish kid, or at least a kid that's not growing up Jewish, that has been exposed to the best form of who we are. So my son and my daughter are in a way like ambassadors for who we are. And there's value there. Now, do I think everybody should be in public schools? No. Do I think all Jews should be in private schools? Also no. I think we need to sort ourselves into where we can have the most impact and the best education for our kids.
And I'll just say, we started as the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values because we saw the ideology that we're talking about in Jewish day schools, in the reform and conservative movements of Judaism, in the federations. And that was the original actually mission of our organization, was to warn the Jewish community of that ideology. So don't expect to go to a Jewish day school and not have some of these problems. The NAIS is associated with many of those day schools, and they are a big problem that we're looking to tackle as well. I'll take us to our last. I'm just going to kind of throw out a concept or a topic because there's a lot of places it could go. It could really unpack a big conversation, but we've alluded to it a little bit, and it's fighting anti-Semitism in general. We premise in our white paper that there's an over-index on Jewish education and Holocaust education, and that those things are important. However, if there's an ideology in place that frames the people who are teaching that education or the people who are being educated about in a certain way, it's really just going to fall on deaf ears, and they're going to fall into the same constructs that place us in the place that we are. There's also this idea that Brett Stevens put out there that we should be investing more in day schools and in Jewish identity and in cultural institutions. And he went as far as to suggest we should dismantle organizations like the ADL in order to do so. And then we have, Shabbos, you referenced the $15 million ad. I know that could fund NAVI's budget for a long time, right? So what do you... What do you guys think about this conversation? It's a nuanced conversation for sure. I don't think any of these are the answer as a silver bullet. But what are your thoughts? Where are we over-indexing? Where are we under-indexing? What should we definitely not do? And what do we definitely need to do?
Well, you want to take it first, or should I?
Go ahead.
So I'd say there's a few things here. One, I don't think we're over-indexing education about the Holocaust. The majority of states do not have any law that says that the Holocaust should be taught. Columbia University's core curriculum that is supposed to give students, many of them will end up being teachers, some of them, unfortunately, politicians. It's supposed to give them history of humankind. They read from the Bible, the New Testament, the Quran, the Haitian independence, all this. They took post-colonialism. One thing they don't ever talk about is the Holocaust, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is when we do teach the Holocaust, we teach it, I think, in a very bad and almost cartoonish way. First, we teach it like as a universal, like, oh, people were killed, like not Jews and others, but Jews were specifically killed. And we start the Holocaust by teaching about Auschwitz. And the Holocaust did not start in Auschwitz. It started in the 1920s with Der Stürmer, with ideas, with student organizations, with a failed putsch in 1923, which builds up slowly, right? But if you think Holocaust, Auschwitz, then you can't see the process. And we're not teaching the process. That is on education. In terms of Bret Stephens' point, look, if every Jewish parent, individual was contributing now and all hands were on deck, then I would say, yes, we maybe need to shift a little bit the resources. The truth is, there's enough to do both in the fighting against anti-Semitism and fighting for Jewish education. Most parents and most individuals are not involved. And I sometimes think that I should be doing more, right? So we had a conversation about Jewish schools and should I send it to Jewish schools? And look, as an atheist Jew, I don't feel comfortable in every Jewish private school, right? But there are a lot of people like me. So why shouldn't we start a new private school that gives that kind of Jewish education, right? So there's a lot of things we still can't do. And it just, so finding now about how to allocate resources is not the right path. I think it's how to get more people to give more time, money, and energy, and then we can talk about that. And in terms of the Robert Kraft ad, I will say this. On the one hand, when you have your own $15 million, you spend it on whatever you want. Right? This isn't Jewish money. This is Robert Kraft's money, right? And I believe there's 15 million Jews, around the world. If we each gave $1, we could have put a different ad. So I don't go and point to him and say, oh, how did you do this? Like, this is your money. I think you just wasted $15 million, but people waste more money for more frivolous stuff. The thing that worries me is that no one in the room even thought to ask a high school student, hey, does this ever happen? Because I think that the ad was perfect except for one tiny thing. Kids, high schoolers, middle schoolers will tell you this is exactly what happens, but instead of dirty Jew, it says dirty Zionist. Everything else could have stayed exactly the same in the ad, and I promise you it would have been a gut-wrenching ad if it just, the sticky note that was put on him said dirty Zionist, because that is what's happening in reality. And that is looking the beast in the eye rather than looking a cartoon version of what I think the beast is, because you can't fight the beast unless you see it for what it really is. When I have $50 million, you'll see me in the Super Bowl running a different ad.
Shabbos?
Okay, yeah, I would, let me start with Robert Kraft, because I agree with much of what Shai just said. The point of contention here isn't that it was a waste of money. I mean, it obviously was a waste of money, but to your point, Shai, it's his money, and $15 million isn't really breaking the bank of a billionaire. The problem to me is twofold. Well, it's actually threefold. Number one, and this is a little controversial to say, so people don't want to say it, but it's just statistically, it's true. The ad itself is a total statistical inversion of reality. Unfortunately, the particularly young African-American community, particularly in New York City, is way more disproportionately represented in anti-Semitic attacks. The likelihood of you being a New York City Jew and being attacked by a young person as part of the African-American community, unfortunately, they're way overrepresented, which I wish is not true, but it clearly is true. So we have to do a lot more work with the African-American community and build alliances and relationships. The reality is the biggest defender of that, 14-year-old kid in the ad would probably be a white Christian with a MAGA hat, which again, I know people don't like to hear that, but statistically speaking, it's actually quite true. So that's number one.
They wouldn't be let with the hat into school.
That's true. They would not be allowed into
the hat, but that's the point, right? Like,
well, if they went to a Jewish day school, maybe they would be allowed to wear the hat. Although that's probably a reason not to go to Jewish day schools. So I shouldn't have said that. The second point of contention here with the ad is fundamentally it ignores the real issue at play, and it provides an excuse for those with positions of power who can actually solve the problem to not solve the problem. What do I mean by that? I wrote an open letter to Robert Kraft, and actually I got confirmation from one of his staff members that he had actually read it. When we were in the thick of our activism, when I was still at Harvard, before I endorsed Trump, before I really became involved in politics, I was trying to do everything either in a nonpartisan fashion or in a bipartisan fashion. We met with Chuck Schumer and with Chuck Schumer's staff on a multitude of occasions. And one of the things we were really invested in was the AAA, the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which among other things would codify IRA into law. I cannot tell you how many times Chuck Schumer pointed to the blue pin that he was wearing and talk about his friendship with Robert Kraft and say how much he loves him, how much he hates anti-Semitism, and he's proud to stand, with the Blue Square Alliance or whatever it was called at the time. They've since rebranded. Chuck Schumer, who at the time was the Senate Majority Leader, he actively used his friendship with Robert Kraft. He actively used his participation with the Blue Square Alliance to not advance pieces of practical policy and legislation that would help Jewish students. I'll repeat that one last time because it's important that not just Robert Kraft hears this, but people who support the organization and the American Jewish donor world. We young American Jews were being lied to. He told us, Chuck Schumer said, that he would put the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act to a floor vote. He never did. And not only did he never do that, but he was able to sort of scapegoat himself by saying, but I love fighting against hate. And I love Robert Kraft because look at this blue square. In fact, Chuck Schumer spoke at the Democratic Convention. And even though at that point in time, there was no serious conversation within his party to defund universities, even though there was no serious conversation about deporting foreign students who violate the law, even though there was no serious conversation about ending this de facto weapons embargo against Israel, even though there was no serious conversation about advancing the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, Chuck Schumer, in his speech at the Democratic Convention, he points to the blue square that he's wearing and says, I use this to remind me to fight hate. Well, that's a really dangerous sign. If you can say, I'm wearing a pin, and therefore I'm absolved from actually doing my job as a policymaker. That's why I was so upset at this ad, and that's what I wanted to convey to Robert Kraft, that you are a good man with good intentions, and people in positions of power are abusing what you are doing and are using you as a tool to not actually help Jews and to not actually fight anti-Semitism. That's why it was such a dangerous and foolish ad. In terms of the Holocaust, I agree with almost everything Shai just said. I went to Harvard to study the Holocaust. I did not go to sue them. That's why I'm depressed all the time, because I studied the Holocaust. And it's a very depressing subject. In fact, you can't see, but all the books in front of me are all Holocaust literature and scholarship on the Holocaust. You can go to every single Holocaust museum in the world, and I've been to a fair amount. You will not walk away. In 95% of them, you will not walk away with any understanding of what Judaism is, who Jewish people are, what our practices is, what our culture looks like. You will walk away at best with a feeling of, I feel really bad because these scrawny Jews in these grainy black and white photos were victims. And I don't want to be seen as victims. I want to be seen as part of this, 3,000-year-old miraculous story that have outlasted the Byzantines and the Romans and the Persians and the Greeks and the Egyptians. That's what we want to be seen as. And also fundamentally, Modi actually makes this point comedically, but I make this point kind of seriously. If you take someone who hates Jews and you say, rather than prosecuting you if you violated a law, instead we're going to send you a Holocaust museum, you're just going to give them really good ideas. Like, what exactly is the lesson here? Someone who hates Jews is now being forced to watch all these creative and ingenious ways that Jews were killed. What is the practical lesson here? And in fact, the practical lesson has been so perverted, unfortunately, by a lot of Holocaust museums themselves. So again, this is a public story, so I'm not revealing anything private here, but the LA Holocaust Museum was forced to take down an Instagram post where they had posted a picture of essentially a man with a tattoo from Auschwitz hanging onto a black man, hanging onto a transgender man, hanging down to, an immigrant, all this intersectional identities, with the slogan being, never again. The lesson of the Holocaust is never again means never again for anyone. To be absolutely clear, like, racism is awful and we should fight against it, and transphobia is awful and we should fight against it, and xenophobia is racist and we should fight against it. The lesson of the Holocaust is not that. The lesson of the Holocaust is a particularly Jewish story that anti-Semitism, if left unchecked, can lead to really, really bad things. It's like if you were teaching slavery in the United States and you were teaching the story of civil rights, and then the lesson is, just general hatred against blacks or whites or anyone, it's bad. That's a good lesson to teach people, but that's not the story of slavery. The story of slavery is, this is what happens when racism goes unchecked. And we would do a tremendous disservice, not only to the historical record, but to our African-American friends, to teach slavery and Jim Crow in this universalist message of, isn't it just so bad? Kind of what Whoopi Goldberg said on The View. Isn't it so bad when people are intolerant towards other people? Yes, that is bad. But that's not the lesson of slavery, and that's not the lesson of the Holocaust. It's like if you were to teach the Armenian genocide as a story of, again, what happens when neighbors don't get along. That's not the story of the Armenian genocide. It was like a very particular and specific ethnic hatred that the Turks or the Ottomans had against the Armenians. So look what happens when anti-Armenian hatred is left unchecked. And I just find that the Holocaust today, because it's just so universalized, means almost nothing to anyone, which is why you had...
I want to add something, Shabbos, because I want to hear what you have to say about this. Someone told me, I don't want to say who it is, but someone told me that he was talking about the ADL, but this could be about any one of the major organizations. He said, if on October 6th, their board members were not just children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, but also children and grandchildren of Farhud survivors, of anti-Semitism from, Hamas-like, ideology, the ADL, the AJC, and all the others would have been better prepared. Because the Holocaust is also not the only, like, the Spanish Inquisition affected Jews, the Second Temple, destruction of the Second Temple, presumably affected more Jews in the long run than the Holocaust, not to take away from the Holocaust, obviously, but there's been so many things. If we just talk about this one specific kind of Jew hatred, we're only going to be ready to tackle one specific kind of Jew hatred. If we have to talk about all different kinds. Yes. What do you think? Like,
I couldn't agree with you more. The Holocaust was certainly a genocide or a hatred of Jews on its most extreme level, obviously, but it's a pattern of 3,000 years of this is what happens when anti-Semitism goes unchecked. And if you only focus on one particular incident, well, that's why you have so many Holocaust deniers today. Because if you can deny that the Holocaust happened, then you can deny your responsibility to fight anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism was only the 6-year thing between 1939 and 1945, which really brings me to my last point. I believe in Holocaust education. Again, I went to Harvard to study the Holocaust. I've been to Poland more than like 30 times. I'll be back there next month. I believe in Holocaust education and going to Holocaust museums, but I don't believe that we use the Holocaust in order to combat anti-Semitism. And in fact, there's almost no serious data set that supports the idea that an increase of Holocaust education actually decreases anti-Semitism. Right. Not only is there no serious study that supports that, but there's actually an emerging body of academic literature that seems to actually support the opposite. So I believe in, like, go to Holocaust museums, but not because it's combating anti-Semitism, but because you should learn the history of your people, if you're Jewish, and also just the history of the world. Again, I actually go to when I'm in Jerusalem, the Armenian Genocide Museum. It's not because I have any connection or know that many Armenians, but as like a human being on this world, I owe it to myself to know what happened to this people and what it means to have anti-Armenian sentiments. So go to Holocaust museums, but let's not fool ourselves into thinking that that's a response to anti-Semitism. And again, that kind of connects back to this Robert Kraft thing. Kathy Hochul is a mixed bag, let's say. I don't want to get too political, but I was very bothered by the fact that shortly after, I don't even remember which synagogue it was at this point because there are too many to keep track of, but there was a particular anti-Semitic incident at one of the synagogues, and she responded by saying, well, next week I'm signing a bill at the Museum of Jewish Heritage to increase the funding to Holocaust education in the state of New York. What is the connection between either of those things? The response to an anti-Semitic, whatever the incident was at the synagogue, was like, we are going to find the assailants and we are going to prosecute them. And if need be, we're going to provide security to the synagogue. But to say we're going to increase Holocaust education and to use that as a tool to absolve yourself from dealing with the actual anti-Semitism on the ground today, that to me is just, it's insanity. And that's where I get really, really bothered with the state of Holocaust or anti-Semitism industrial complex today. And I think one of the coolest details of the Bret Stephens speech, which I did not know this until I read the Jay Insider article, was that Jonathan Greenblatt was actually in the audience when Bret Stephens disbanded the ADL. So whether I agree or disagree with that statement, kudos to Bret Stephens for actually saying that to the guy in the room. That takes a lot of kahunas. So I will leave it at that. I think there was a third point I wanted to. Oh, it was the third point I want to make, and then I will shut up. Sorry, this was the main point I wanted to make. Actually, I wrote an article. I don't even remember where it is at this point, but I wrote an article recently. How in the spring of 2023 there was an organization I think called iShine or Shadowlight, and they brought a replica of an Auschwitz cattle car to Harvard University. It was on Harvard's campus for like 10 days. I went there. I went to the exhibit. I brought my friends there. And Claudine Gay, who she was not the president. I don't believe she was the interim president at the time. Correct. Larry Bacow was the interim president at the time. But so Larry Bacow spoke. Larry Summers, the previous president of Harvard, spoke. Claudine Gay spoke. And they all spoke about the importance of studying history, and never again means never again. This is in May of 2023. And then June, July, August, September, October, not even 5 months later, the same woman who was in front of a replica Auschwitz cattle car who says the Holocaust was just so terrible, oh my gosh, 5 months later says you could actually call for the genocide of Jews depending on the right context. That to me is a quite remarkable manifestation of the problems of using Holocaust education as a tool to combat anti-Semitism. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Shabbos. I appreciate you bringing up the Armenian genocide. Actually, my great-grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide, and I don't see them as the same. They're completely different circumstances. I think we need to treat those things as different circumstances. And what we see in Illinois, where I am, there's Holocaust education that is required, but what ends up happening is schools universalize it. Our school here doesn't. They take the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's now Genocide Day. And the assignments are universalizing it to other people's genocides. And so I think it's really important what you're saying. It's how and what we use it for, not necessarily that, we need to just get states to sign on to Holocaust education. So thank you both.
But by the way, I do want to kudos to Shabbos, because Shabbos taught me something. I then went and I read some books about this. But when I interviewed Shabbos in my first season of my podcast, he said, when I think of October 7, I don't want to think about October 7, 2023. I want to think about October 7, I think 1944,
yes,
where the Zunder Commando in Birkenau revolted. And they burnt they basically bombed the crematoriums, so to slow down the Nazi machine, of killing. So even when we teach about the Holocaust, we don't have to teach about the victim or just about the victimization. We can teach about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We can just one picture. I took my kids to the Jewish Heritage Museum, part of the grassroots movement that we did last weekend. And we went through a lot of people, and there was one picture of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto making matzahs for Passover. And to think that they are going through like the worst thing of their lives yet, because they don't know where this train is headed yet, and still are celebrating their Jewish identity. That was a lesson that I wanted to my son, who I am raising, you can be whatever you want, but I'm an atheist Jew. I wanted my son to see. So even when we teach about the Holocaust, we have to remember we're trying to teach about the values, and our values are Jewish values, and how other people's hateful values went against that.
Thank you guys so much. There's so many things we could unpack more. I was hoping to get to how we build coalitions with others in order to solve these problems in schools. We could probably have a whole nother webinar just on that. But I wanted to let everybody who's still here know There's a link here for a national WhatsApp group for NAVI. I know it's another WhatsApp group, but our WhatsApp groups are a little bit different because it's not just about anti-Semitism. It's not just about being pro-Israel. It's about the ideological indoctrination in schools. It's K-12 specific. And it's about how we remove the individuals who are perpetuating this from power and what we do to advocate for that. And it's also a place for you, what we talked about before, to report what you're going through, for us to help support you, for us to get attention on it, and for us to help advocate for you in the ways that we do with government officials at local school boards, so on and so forth. We also have another webinar coming up at the same time next week. This one is called Upstream Activism, How Teachers, Colleges Shape K-12 Classrooms. That's going to be with Lyle Asher, Brandy Shufutinsky, and Daniel Bach, and moderated by our Chief Program Officer, Dana Stengel-Plow, who has her own cancellation story of herself from being a teacher at a private school. So please join us for that. Thank you everyone for joining. Shai, Shabbos, thank you so much, and for everything you do. Hopefully we can do it again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.